The gilt doors of the antechamber stood open, and the October light fell across the marble in long, pale rectangles, and every person of consequence in the kingdom was present to witness what happened next. Cecily Vane stood at the edge of the receiving line, 2 steps behind Lady Ashmore, as was correct, her cream gown neat and her gloves buttoned to the wrist, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance the way a woman learns to fix them when she has spent 2 years making herself invisible. While the room smelled of beeswax and hothouse flowers and the particular cold weight of ceremony. She had not expected to be here at all. She had not expected anything, which was the only useful lesson her life had managed to teach her. Edmund Ashmore, Viscount Ashmore, stood at his mother's left, his dark coat perfectly fitted, his expression composed in the way stone is composed. He had barely looked at her since his return to London 6 days prior. When the introductions began and the chamberlain reached their small party, he spoke before his mother could. "My mother, Lady Ashmore," he said, "my mother's companion, a servant girl of the household, a servant girl." The words did not echo. The room absorbed them the way fine rooms absorb small disasters, with a kind of padded indifference that was in its way more wounding than any gasp could have been. The king turned. He was older than his portraits. His face settled into a particular gravity that portraiture was not equal to. He looked at Cecily with the attention of a man who has trained his entire life to look without appearing to look, and something shifted in his expression. He held out his hand. "My dear," he said, "Cecily Vane. We have not met since you were 4 years old, I think. You have very much your father's eyes." He turned his attention, briefly, deliberately, to Edmund. "This young woman, my lord, is the daughter of Captain George Vane, of the 7th, who was my mother's cousin and my own. She is my cousin, and she will be addressed accordingly." The room did not make a sound. Edmund Ashmore's face did not change. That was the singular thing, and the terrible thing, and the thing Cecily would carry afterward. He had not turned pale. He had not flinched. He stood in his error the way he stood in everything, with his spine perfectly straight. And the only evidence of what had happened was the absence of any expression at all, as though expression itself had simply evacuated his face and left the architecture standing. Cecily curtsied, and she said what was required, and she did not cry. She had learned, by then, not to cry in rooms where it would be seen. 3 weeks before that morning, Ashmore House on Clarges Street was still a household organized around Lady Constance Ashmore's particular genius for appearing to offer comfort while delivering correction. The drawing room was cream and gold. The fires were laid punctually at 7 in the evening, and Cecily's position in it had been established within her first week. She was to read aloud when reading was wanted, to accompany Lady Ashmore to calls when a companion was wanted, and to disappear when neither was required. She was good at disappearing. She had been practicing since her father died. Captain George Vane had died when Cecily was 17, leaving behind him a hired cottage, £40 of debt, and a reputation for financial recklessness that the village of Kempton had spent 3 years elaborating into something approaching legend. Cecily had understood, in the weeks after the funeral, that the world had already reached its verdict on her. She was the reckless captain's daughter. She had no fortune and no connections that she knew of, and no particular beauty that the world had chosen to notice. She found her position through a solicitor's introduction, packed a single trunk, and arrived at Ashmore House on a Thursday morning in August with her father's small oval miniature tucked into the corner of the trunk beneath her winter gloves. She did not show it to anyone. It was all she had of him, and she had learned that things shown to people had a way of becoming things taken from them. Lady Constance received her in the morning room with a smile that was warm, in the way that marble is warm, after a hand has rested on it. "You are precisely what I was hoping for," she said, and the words had felt like a compliment at the time. It was 2 months before Cecily understood they were something else. "She is simply a companion, of course," Lady Constance said to Miss Lavinia Pemberton's mother on the afternoon of Cecily's second Tuesday in the house. The door to the adjoining salon was ajar. Cecily did not move from her chair. A servant girl of no particular origin. One does not inquire too closely. They are so much more useful when they feel they owe you something. Mrs. Pemberton made a murmuring sound that might have been assent. Cecily turned the page of the book she was not reading, and she noted that she had been assessed and shelved in less time than it had taken Lady Constance to order her morning chocolate. She did not permit herself to feel it. She had learned that, too. The Viscount Ashmore arrived 6 days before the royal audience, in a hired carriage at 4:30 in the afternoon, which meant he had driven through the night from the estate. Cecily saw him from the landing window, which she reached by accident on her way to return a book to the upper library. A tall figure stood in the street below in a dark traveling coat, his hat in his hand, his face turned briefly upward as though calculating the height of the house before he entered it. She went back to her own task and did not think about the calculation in his face. She met him properly at dinner, where his mother installed them across from each other, and proceeded to conduct a conversation that excluded Cecily so completely and so skillfully that it constituted a kind of art. He looked at her once, in the way people look at objects they have placed in a room and forgotten about. She said nothing that was not required. She excused herself early with a headache that was perfectly plausible, and she went upstairs and stood at her window in the dark and held her father's miniature in both hands until she was steady again. 3 days later she found the small carved box that was missing from the lower library. Mrs. Crowe, the housekeeper, was in the passage outside the kitchen, with her hand on the shoulder of Agnes, the youngest of the kitchen girls, who was 16 and red-faced. And very close to weeping, the carved box was on the floor between them. "You will tell me where you put it," Mrs. Crowe was saying, in the voice of someone who has decided on a conclusion before gathering evidence. "I did not take it," Agnes said. "I swear, on my mother." Cecily came down the service stairs because she had come to learn the service stairs were faster. She stopped. "The box was in the lower library this morning," she said. "I moved it myself. I placed it on the left-hand shelf beside the atlas because it was blocking the stack Mrs. Ashmore once sent to the bindery." Here she crossed to the floor, picked it up, and held it out to Mrs. Crowe. "It is undamaged. Agnes did nothing." Mrs. Crowe looked at her with the flat appraisal of a woman who does not enjoy being corrected by companions. "As you say, Miss Vane," she said, and dismissed Agnes with a short nod, and went back through the kitchen door without another word. Agnes said in a voice so low it barely cleared the threshold, "Thank you, miss." Cecily nodded and went back up the service stairs, and she did not know that he had been standing in the passage beside the door to the boot room for the entirety of the exchange, and that he had not moved until she was well past him and gone. He had come for his riding boots. He stayed for 2 minutes after she left, his boots in his hand, looking at the door she had gone through with the particular attention of a man trying to explain something to himself that is not yet ready to be explained. He had watched the whole of it from the shadows of the boot room, the door open a crack, and he had seen Cecily come down the service stairs with a book in her hand and take in the scene in the passage with the assessment of someone accustomed to arriving at situations already in progress. He had seen the way she placed the box in Mrs. Crowe's hands, not as supplication, but as evidence. He had seen Agnes's shoulders drop from the rigid line of anticipated punishment into the soft collapse of relief. He had seen Cecily nod once and turn back for the stairs without waiting for thanks, without appearing to want them. He had grown up in a house full of people performing virtue. He had not before seen someone perform it for an audience of none. He found her that evening in the lower library, which no one used except her sitting with her book and the lamp at the corner table. He said nothing for a moment. "You did not have to do that for Agnes," he said. "No," she agreed. "It cost you something." She looked up. His expression was the usual composed arrangement, but the vertical line between his brows was deeper than before, and he was looking at her in a way she had not seen him look at anything. "It cost me nothing I cannot afford," she said, which was not entirely true, but was the only available answer. He was quiet again. "Have you eaten?" he said. "Come and eat something." Mrs. Crow will not have thought to send a tray." She almost refused. She did not refuse. She ate supper at the small table in the morning room while he stood at the window with his wine. And she understood, as she ate, that the command had been a form of attention she did not yet know how to read. The fire was low. The candle on the table between them threw light at an angle that caught his profile and made a precise thing of it, the jaw and the ridge of the nose and the particular depth of his eyes, which were turned toward the window and not toward her. She was aware of exactly where he was in the room, without looking at him directly, which was itself a kind of information she was not prepared to have. Her pulse was entirely ordinary. She told herself so while eating the bread he had had someone bring, which was warm, and she thought about the fact that he had thought to have it sent. And she ate the bread, and she was not cold for the first time in 3 days, and she would not think about any of this. He spoke once at the end, without turning from the window. "You have been in this house 2 months," he said. 8 weeks on Friday," she said. A silence. "Good night, Miss Vane," he said and left, and she remained at the table with the candle burning down and the fire settling, and the warmth of the bread still in her hands, and she thought, 8 weeks. Yes, she had been counting. If she had known what he was doing with that attentiveness, she might have guarded against it. She did not know, because no one had told her the thing she was about to learn about him, which was this. He did not give his attention easily or often, and when he gave it, it was because something in the landscape of his day had surprised him into a stillness he could not talk himself back out of. His wife's name had been Margaret. Cecily did not know this for 3 more days. She learned it when she went to return a volume to the upper gallery and found the portrait half turned from the wall. It was a small oil painting, carefully done, of a young woman with light brown hair and an expression of great calm. On the frame's inner edge, in small letters, Margaret, Louise Ashmore, 1810. Cecily put the book on the nearest shelf and went very quietly back down the stairs. She did not ask about it. 2 evenings later, when Edmund appeared in the doorway of the lower library, looking the way that men who are not accustomed to uncertainty look when uncertainty has found them, and said, quite without preamble, "My wife died 18 months ago." She had wanted to stay at the estate for her confinement. I insisted on London. He stopped. "I mention it only because my mother is attempting to revive certain social arrangements that I am not yet certain I am equal to. I wanted you to understand why I may be poor company at the upcoming engagement." At court, Cecily looked at him for a moment. "I am sorry," she said. She was very beautiful. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "You saw the portrait?" "I did not intend to." "No, I know." He was quiet for a moment. He reached into his breast pocket, and what he produced was not what she expected. It was a small oval miniature, framed simply, of a young woman in a blue dress. Margaret again, painted younger. He held it for a moment, then set it face down on the shelf beside him. "I have not been able to put it away," he said. "I find that I simply turn it over when I cannot manage it." Cecily was silent. "That was a great deal more than I intended to say," he said, and left. She sat for a long time after he was gone. Then she reached into her pocket and held her own miniature, her father's face in the plain oval frame, and she thought about what it meant that 2 people could be sitting in adjacent rooms in the same house, each of them turned away from something they could not manage to put down. She did not tell him about her father's portrait, not then. She did not tell him about the morning she had spent the previous week in the small sitting room with Lady Constance, when the Viscountess had put before her an envelope containing £25, and had said, with perfect pleasantness, "I think you will be more comfortable in a different position. There is a family in Kensington who would suit you very well. I have already written on your behalf." Cecily had looked at the envelope for a long moment. "I was not made aware that my position here was ending," she said. "These things are sometimes easier to arrange without a great deal of consultation." "I believe I will stay," Cecily said, and she had pushed the envelope back across the table, and she had gone upstairs with her heart hammering against her ribs and her face, as still as she could manage. and she had taken out her father's miniature and sat with it until the hammering slowed. She could not have said why she refused, only that something in the quietness of the refusal felt like the one thing she still owned. The letter from the Lord Chamberlain arrived on a Thursday. Lady Constance read it at breakfast with a particular stillness that told Cecily everything about its contents, before she reached for the marmalade and said, to no one in particular, "We have been invited to attend the King's reception at St. James's. How very kind." How very kind meant something was about to be managed. That evening, Lavinia Pemberton came to dinner with her mother, and after the covers were removed, Lady Constance arranged the drawing-room so that Edmund sat near Lavinia and Cecily sat near the door, which was simply the architecture of an argument made in upholstery. Miss Pemberton was 22 years old, and very fair, and possessed of the kind of polish that is the result of every advantage applied consistently from the earliest age. She wore pale rose silk and diamond drops in her ears, and she moved through a drawing-room, as though the room had been built to receive her. She said to Lady Ashmore in a voice that was not quite private, "Your companion seems pleasant enough. They are so much easier to manage when they are plain." Lady Constance smiled. "One does find it so," she said. Edmund, across the room, said nothing. The following afternoon, Cecily came down the back stairs from the schoolroom where she had been helping the household accounts, and found Edmund in the library. He was standing at the window, which meant she could see his profile, and his profile was doing the thing it sometimes did in her presence when he did not know she was there. His expression was not composed. The vertical line between his brows was deep, and his mouth was not level, and he was looking at nothing in particular with the attention of a man arguing with himself in silence. She stopped in the doorway. He turned. "Come in," he said. "I want to show you something." He went to the second shelf of the window alcove and produced a slender volume, old cloth binding, and held it out to her. It was a collection of correspondence published after the peace. One letter had been marked with a strip of paper. She took the book and read the marked passage. It was a letter from Colonel Vane of the 7th, dated 1814, addressed to a junior officer in his company, and marked by the editor as an example of the correspondence of the officer class. It was signed simply, "Your cousin's cousin-in-arms." She looked up at him. "I found it last week," he said, "when I was cataloguing the books for my father's study. Your name is not common, and the regiment is the same." He was watching her with the attention she had stopped trying to explain to herself. "I do not know what it means. I thought you should see it." She looked back at the letter. Her father's hand for the first time in 5 years. The ink was faded to a brownish gray at the edges. The letters formed in the slanted style of a man who had been taught by someone meticulous and had then spent 20 years riding in the field, which gave them a peculiar combination of precision and speed. She knew that hand. She knew the way he formed his capital letters, the way he looped the tail of the letter Y, the way he signed his name in a single unbroken stroke, as if he were always in a hurry to move on to the next thing. He had always been in a hurry to move on to the next thing. Your cousin's cousin in arms. Her eyes went warm, and she did not allow anything further. She closed the book and held it back out to him. "May I borrow it?" she said, "for an evening?" "Keep it," he said, and that was the end of it. And it was not the end of anything. She did not look at Edmund as she left the library. She was aware that he was still standing at the window, and that he had not moved while she read, and that his attention had been on her, rather than on the middle distance, and she did not look at him because she was not certain what her face would do if she did. She went back to her room, and sat on the bed with the book open to the marked page, and read the letter 4 times, and then she held her father's miniature in her left hand and the open book in her right. And she thought about her father, who had known who he was, and had simply never told her. She did not yet know that Edmund had, 3 days before, showing her the letter written separately to a Mr. Holt of the Lord Chamberlain's office. She did not know what Mr. Holt had written back. She did not know the morning she stood in the receiving line at St. James's that a small sealed document had been placed in Edmund's breast pocket by a footman on his way into the antechamber. She knew only what she had always known. She was a companion and a servant girl, and the daughter of a man the world had decided to forget, and she stood 2 steps behind Lady Ashmore, and looked at the middle distance and waited for it to be over. She could not have known how it would end. If you have ever stood in a room where the wrong words have been spoken, you know what the silence after them feels like. It is not nothing. It is a held breath, the whole room suspended between what was said and what will be said next, and everything depends on what comes next, and for a long moment nothing does. The king called her his cousin. The room released its breath. Cecily curtsied, and she steadied herself on her own stillness, and she said the correct things, and the king spoke to her kindly, for 3 minutes about her father's service and her father's character, and a summer he could still recall when she had been a small child in a garden in Somerset. He said her father had been the best horseman of his generation and the worst gambler, and he said it with an affection that dismantled the word debtor as thoroughly as a letter of credit, and then he moved on to the next party, because a king cannot pause indefinitely in the wreckage of a small revelation. Edmund stood at his mother's left for the duration of this exchange, with his face perfectly composed and his hands still at his sides. When it was over, Cecily walked back through the gilt doors with Lady Ashmore, at a pace that required her to match the Viscountess step for step, and she did not look at Edmund, and he did not speak to her. And the carriage ride home was conducted in a silence that Lady Constance occupied by looking out the window with an expression of absolute tranquility that Cecily recognized by now as the expression she wore when she was rapidly revising a plan. Edmund sat across from them, his hat on his knee, his hand still. He looked once at Cecily, very briefly, with an expression she did not have a name for, and then he looked out his own window, and said nothing for the length of Pall Mall, and the turning into St. James's, and the long straight stretch toward Clarges Street. At the door of the house, he handed his mother down, and then his hand was there for Cecily, which was not something he had done before, and she took it because there was no alternative that did not involve stepping down poorly in her good slippers, and his grip was steady and brief and entirely correct. And he released her the moment her foot was on the pavement. And that was the whole of it. She went inside, without looking at him. She sat in her room for an hour with her coat on and her gloves in her lap, and thought about a king who remembered a 4-year-old girl in a Somerset garden, and a father who had never told his daughter who he was connected to, and whether there were things a person could be that they did not know themselves to be, and whether that made any difference to anything. The assembly at the Houghtons' house came 3 evenings later, and Miss Pemberton was there in white and silver with her mother and 2 of her particular friends. Cecily wore her cream gown, which was beginning to show the strain of a season's use at the hem. She stood near the window with a glass she had not opened. She heard her name. Miss Pemberton's voice was not uncareful. It was simply not careful enough. "The servant girl," she said to her friends with a small, precise laugh. After a week's embarrassment, she ought to have gone when Lady Ashmore gave her the opportunity. Her friends murmured, "It changes nothing," Miss Pemberton said. "A connection on paper is not a connection in practice." The king spoke to her for 3 minutes. The Viscount will not. Cecily set her glass on the ledge without touching the contents, and looked for the first time in several days at the room around her, and understood that she was very tired. Not of the people, particularly. Of the effortfulness of continuing to exist in spaces that would prefer her absence. Edmund did not approach her that evening. He danced with Miss Pemberton twice and spoke with his mother at length, and was observed to be attentive and correct, and precisely what the season expected from a viscount in mourning's 2nd year. He glanced at Cecily once across the room, with an expression she could not read at the distance, and then glanced away. She went home early. She climbed the back stairs in the dark because the back stairs were faster, and she went into her small room at the back of the house, where the window looked onto the mews. And the fire was not lit and would not be lit until tomorrow morning, and she stood in the dark for a moment with her coat still on. She took out her father's miniature and set it on the pillow and looked at it for a long time. She thought of the £25 she had refused. She thought of the solicitor's letter in the drawer. The position in Kensington she had not taken, because she had not understood yet what she was refusing it for, She thought of Agnes's shoulders dropping out of their braced posture. She thought of a book held out across a library table by a man who had found it, and thought of her. She thought of her name spoken at a small table in a morning room, and what it had felt like to say 8 weeks on Friday to a man who did not need to know how many weeks it had been. She understood now that she had been foolish. Not in the way the season had always supposed she was foolish, which was the foolishness of poor birth and plain looks and no connections. She had been foolish in the private way, that is much more costly, which was the foolishness of having hoped, carefully, invisibly, without even fully admitting to herself that hoping was what she was doing. In the morning she would write to the solicitor who had placed her. There were other positions. There were always other positions. She would find one that was far enough from Clarges Street that she would not spend the next year watching carriage traffic and performing arithmetic about who might be inside. She fell asleep with the miniature in her hand and woke at 4 in the morning to find it still there, pressed into her palm, and she thought of her father. He was the king's cousin, too. And the world had forgotten him. And that was what the world did, and had always done, and would continue to do. Whether or not she was here to watch it, she lay in the gray light and prepared herself for absence. She did not prepare herself for the knock at her door at 7:30 the following morning, which was not a servant's knock. She put on her wrapper and opened the door. He stood in the passage in his day coat and no cravat, which was the most disheveled she had ever seen him, and he had clearly been awake for some time. The vertical line between his brows was very deep. "I need to show you something," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You might wait," she said, "while I dress." He waited downstairs in the hall, turning his hat in both hands. She came down 12 minutes later in her cream gown, with her hair done simply, and he led her without a word to the morning room, which was empty, the fire not yet lit. He put a document on the table. It was a copy of a letter from Mr. Potter. Holt's office, dated 3 days prior to the royal audience. It outlined, in the precise language of a clerk who takes care with facts, the lineage of Captain Vane, late of the 7th, his relationship to the maternal branch of the royal family, and the informal acknowledgment recorded in the Lord Chamberlain's private register that his daughter, Cecily Jane Vane, was considered a member of the extended royal connection. "I had written to ask," Edmund said before the audience. "I had found the letter in the library, and I wrote, because I needed to know who you were." The reply arrived the morning of the audience. "I had it in my pocket." Cecily looked at the document. "You knew?" she said. "I knew." He was quiet for a moment, and I did not speak. I did not correct my mother's arrangement of the receiving line, and then I said what I said, and the king said what he said. He stopped. "I have spent 3 days understanding that there is no excuse. That is not simply an explanation for a failure of character." She looked at him. "I am prepared," he said, "to make a formal apology. To the members of the household and to any public company you wish, I am also prepared, if you would permit it, to speak to you about a matter of a different kind." He was not looking away. "I would ask you not to leave before I have said what I came to say." She was very still. "I began," he said carefully, as though each word required individual placement, "by finding a letter in a library. I continued by watching you put a carved box on a shelf so that a kitchen girl would not be dismissed for something she did not do. I continued by bringing you supper, which I managed badly, and by showing you a letter, which I managed better, and by thinking about very little else for the better part of 3 weeks, which I managed not at all." He paused. "I am a man who has been wrong about a great many things. About Margaret, who wanted to stay home. About my mother, who I have permitted to arrange too much. About you, who I misread from the first day." He reached into his coat and produced the small oval miniature, Margaret's portrait, and set it on the table beside her father's letter, face up. "I have been carrying this as a reason to do nothing," he said. I do not think she would have recognized it as such. Cecily looked at the miniature on the table. Then she reached into her pocket and set her father's miniature beside it. 2 plain oval frames on the morning room table. 2 faces, looking at the ceiling. Edmund looked at them for a moment. "I would like," he said, "to speak to your solicitor, Miss Vane. With your permission." She looked at him for a long moment. "Cecily," she said. "If we are speaking of solicitors," something shifted in his face. It was not a large shift, but she had learned by then to read his small alterations the way one reads weather in a country where weather decides everything. What she saw was not hope. Exactly. It was something that hope had been constructed from. He said her name, just that. The single word, as though he were testing the weight of it. And then very quietly, nodding, as though it bore up. He did not speak again immediately, but he was closer than he had been, and she was not stepping back. And that, in itself, was a statement. Lady Constance found them in the morning room at 8:30, where they were sitting at the table with 2 miniatures and a letter between them, and a silence that had the character of a decision already made. She stood in the doorway with her hand still on the frame, and looked at the tableau with the expression of a woman who has managed every room she has entered for 40 years, and has just entered one she did not arrange. Edmund looked at his mother. Then he stood. "I am engaged," he said to Miss Vane. He paused. "I will not be receiving counsel on the matter." Lady Constance opened her mouth. "Miss Vane is my intended," he said, "and I will not be corrected." The silence that followed was different from the silence at St. James's. That silence had been the room withholding judgment. This one was the room rendering it. Outside the morning room window, the street was beginning its day. A cart horse's hooves rang on the cobbles. A vendor's call rose and fell, the ordinary music of a city that does not pause for the reckonings of drawing rooms. Inside, the fire was laid but not lit, and the October light came through the window in that pale, specific way it has in London. Honest and without ceremony, Lady Constance set her fan down on the mantelpiece with a small, deliberate click. She looked at Cecily for a moment, with an expression that had resolved, finally, out of its performance of pleasantness, into something simpler, and in its way more honest. "You refused my £25, she said. "I did," Cecily said. Lady Constance looked at her son, who was standing in the unchanged, precise way of a man who has made up his mind about something and does not intend to be argued back out of it. She looked at Cecily again. She picked up her fan. "I see," she said, "and left. Mr. Brock's." Holt arrived at noon, having been sent for that morning, and the documents were reviewed and the letters patent copied and the entry in the Lord Chamberlain's register confirmed. And by 3 in the afternoon the engagement notice had been drafted by Edmund's secretary in the formal terms required by the season. And by 6 it had been delivered to 3 newspapers, and by 8 it was known across every drawing room where such things are known. And in each of those drawing rooms someone said, separately, without coordination, "Well, of course." The Pembertons withdrew from Ashmore House's social calendar the following week. There was no scene, no confrontation. Miss Pemberton simply arranged her diary otherwise, which was precisely what such women do when a season has produced an outcome that requires a period of revision. Lady Constance accepted the situation with the grace of a woman who has never in her life been seen to lose, only to retire temporarily from a field, and she said nothing further about the £25 or about Kensington. Cecily moved to the larger bedroom on the 2nd floor on the day of the engagement at Edmund's insistence. She brought very little, her clothes, her books, her father's miniature. The miniature she placed on the mantelpiece above the fire, which was laid and lit, because Edmund had given instructions that it should be. She stood in front of it for a moment, looking at her father's painted face in the plain oval frame. He had been the king's cousin, and he had not known what that was worth or how to hold it, and the world had taken the rest. She had been his daughter, and she had learned to hold almost nothing. And then she had refused £25 in a morning room, and it had turned out to be everything. She thought about what it would mean to stay. She had not let herself think about it directly before, in the way that she had trained herself not to look directly at things that might not remain. Now she stood in a room that had a fire in it, because someone had arranged for there to be a fire in it, with a mantelpiece that was hers to put things on, and she thought about it in the simple plain terms it deserved. She was going to stay. She ran her thumb along the edge of the miniature's frame, the plain oval she had carried in the corner of a trunk beneath her winter gloves for 5 years, and she thought of her father in his hurry signing letters in a single unbroken stroke, and she thought he would have found the whole of it very funny. And she found that the thought was warm rather than painful, which was something new. Outside the window, the first snow of November was beginning, very light, the kind that does not commit. It fell on the street and disappeared. Fell and disappeared the way weather does when it is practicing. Edmund came into the room quietly, the way he had learned to enter rooms she was in, and stood beside her at the mantelpiece. He looked at the miniature for a moment. "He is very like you," he said. "Around the eyes," she said. He was quiet, and then he said, "Cecily." Only her name, the way he said it. Now, as though it were a habit of his own making, that he had decided not to revise. She did not look at him. She looked at her father's face, and the snow beyond the window and the fire below, and felt the warmth of the room settle around her, the way warmth does, when it is no longer something she is calculating the duration of. She said nothing at all. The snow continued to fall, uncommitted and patient, against the glass. If Cecily's story has moved you, we would be glad to have you stay a little longer. Leave a word in the comments or subscribe, and we will tell you more stories like hers. She did not expect to be chosen. She was. The miniature stayed on the mantelpiece all winter,